day one of Governance Week 2026. What a wonderful day it's been so far. And just before we bring on our panelists, I want to say a sincere thank you and appreciation to our sponsors. You saw them being highlighted there with that lovely music from Joshua Regrello playing pan in the background. This year, we welcome two new sponsors to Governance Week. These are Unilever from Trinidad and Tobago and the Pan Jamaica Group from Jamaica, both offering silver sponsorship. And we are very grateful to all of our returning sponsors. We have Massey Holdings offering silver sponsorship. We also have Republic Bank Limited, First Citizens Bank Limited, and PwC from Trinidad and Tobago, as well as GA Rowe and Sons Limited from Belize. These companies are supporting us with bronze sponsorship. And we are also very thankful to Angostura Limited and Information Link Services Limited for a very special associate sponsor contribution. And of course, we are talking all about governance in a volatile world. And so we too have to navigate in that volatility. We have had three really amazing panels so far. We started earlier today with when leadership is tested, the critical role of board oversight with Claire Gomez-Miller, Yolanda Hughes-Smith, and Oliver Jordan. And this was followed by our second panel just concluded, Decision-Making Under Pressure, Governing in Real Time Amid Crisis and Complexity. And the panel did a really marvelous job. Those were Michelle Oban-Clark, Leslie Ann Seon, and Vashti Gayadeen, with our moderator, Louis Kingsley. So now we come to our third and final panel for today. Their topic, Culture, Ethics, and Accountability, the invisible forces shaping organizational resilience. And we have three very strong panelists, Delia Joseph, Simone Pearson, and Glyne Harrison. So I'd leave the introduction of our panelists to the moderator, who is the very lovely Sarona Roopchan. Sarona is joining us for the first time on Governance Week, serving in this role as moderator. She's the regional manager at Bliss Safety Stores. And Bliss, of course, is a silver organizational member here with us at the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. And part of our role is helping to grow our members. And so we are extremely pleased to have Sarona join us here and participate in this panel. Sarona, I have to ask you to forgive me a little bit. I had to restart my computer, so I'm looking very quickly to find, right, there we go, your profile. And of course, we will not introduce everyone with their full profiles because this has been shared with our participants today in the chat. So Sarona serves as the regional manager for Ben Lomond Industrial and Safety Solutions Limited, which is Bliss Safety Store. And Bliss is, of course, one of Trinidad and Tobago's company that provides safety products in the energy, aviation, and marine sector. In her role, Sarona is responsible for the synergistic coordination of multi-location retail operations, logistics and supply chain management, foreign procurement, and corporate sales. She acts as the hub of cohesion within the management team, driving team development, customer relations, and public relations to ensure that every unit consistently delivers on exceptional customer service. So as young as she looks, we know that Sarona is quite capable. So Sarona, I'm happy to now hand over this panel to you and invite you to introduce your panelists briefly and take over this final session for Governance Week, Day 1.
Thank you, Kamala. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm definitely excited. I'm really delighted to be your moderator for this afternoon's final panel discussion. And of course, as mentioned, our topic, culture, ethics, and accountability, the invisible forces shaping organizational resilience. And we have an excellent line of speakers. I've had the privilege to read through their bios, so I'm going to introduce them to you. First off, we have Delia Joseph. Delia is the director of British American Insurance Company Limited and managing director of Delia H. Joseph Consulting Agency Limited in Trinidad and Tobago. She's an accomplished human resource professional with more than 25 years of experience in developing organizational and employee capability across several industry sectors. Throughout her career, she has held executive leadership positions with organizations including West Indian Tobago, CIBC First Caribbean, Atlantic LNG, and Heritage Petroleum. She also serves on several boards and has chaired human resource committees, bringing extensive expertise in strategic planning, performance management, industrial relations, and corporate governance. Welcome, Delia.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Glyne Harrison. Glyne is a financial services executive and governance leader from Barbados. Welcome. With nearly 4 decades of experience in the financial services industry, his extensive career has given him a comprehensive understanding of the sector and a strong commitment to sound governance and ethical leadership. Glyne has served numerous private and public sector boards, including chair and vice chair, where he has helped shape strategic decisions and strengthen governance practices. He holds an undergraduate degree and 2 postgraduate degrees and has pursued extensive professional training in governance, ethics, and financial services. Welcome, Glyne. And our final panelist, Simone Pearson. Simone is the Group General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of Jamaica Group Limited, a publicly listed multinational with several operations spanning financial services, property, infrastructure, specialty foods, shipping and logistics, hospitality, and global services. She also serves as Corporate Secretary of Jamaica Producers Group Limited and leads the legal and governance portfolio across the group's international businesses. Simone holds a Master's of Law from the University College London, a Bachelor's of Law from the University of West Indies, and was admitted to practice law in 2001. She currently serves on several boards in Jamaica and has held a number of significant public sector appointments throughout her distinguished career. Thank you, guys. And of course, I do apologize. I'm a little bit nervous. But, just as we heard on today's topic, in terms of focusing on culture, ethics, and accountability, for me, these 3 elements are definitely something that's unseen. Yet it's something that we all know is the foundation of good, strong governance, effective leadership, and long-term organizational success as well. Throughout today's discussion, we definitely have explored so many things, and I think this is actually going to be the icing on the cake for today's closing session. And with that being said, I would like to just open up the discussions for you all to share your perspective on today's topic. And if you don't mind, I'd probably like to lead with Delia. And, Delia, drawing on your extensive experience in human resource and organizational development, board governance, how do you see culture and ethics and accountability influencing an organization's ability to remain resilient, and particularly during times of uncertainty?
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Sarona. And let me start off by thanking the Kamla and the team at CCGI for the invitation. So anybody who has worked with me, whether in the capacity as an executive, manager, or on the board, knows me to be somebody who is very, very passionate about culture. And I don't talk culture Trinidad and Tobago in terms of the way we do, we lime and so on. I'm talking about culture as a key enabler of strategy of the business. And for me, when I looked at this topic, when Kamla sent me this topic, I'm like, wow, this is so wide. How do I narrow this down? And also to contribute some meaningful nuggets of learning in the discussion today. So in my headspace, I think people, when they think culture or resilience, they think of it of being individual, but culture in an organization is collective. And it really focuses, if you look at the three aspects of it, culture, ethics, and accountability, culture is the outcome of the ethics we uphold in an organization and the accountability that we practice via our systems, our processes, etc. When culture is resilient, the organization is resilient as an outcome of that. And hence you would see in a lot of discussions and papers and so on, you would see the term culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I like to add for tea, lunch, and everything else. Because if you don't get those aspects right, you can have the best strategy, the Mercedes-Benz, the however you want to coin it, it will result to very little or nothing at all. Because you'll be fighting with internal practices, things that are informal and informal, against your strategy. So for me, resilience is an outcome of culture. And I want to repeat it because I think it's very important. The ethics we uphold, and the accountability by virtue of the practices that we do, right? And if I look at it in its three nuggets, culture informs behavior. It is symbiotic. It is part of what you do, how you do. It's the foundation of your behavior in your organization. Ethics guides those behaviors in a sense. It's accountable actions. It becomes ethics. If you think about it, it's the compass of how you make your decisions, when you make your decisions, and how you apply those decisions. And then, of course, accountability provides the systems and so on, which must be consistent, which must be transparent, and it must not change based on the circumstances that is in front of you. You need to have those three working together. So when you have that, as I said before, you have an organization that becomes resilient because it's able to adapt. It is able to bounce forward, and I'm using the word bounce forward as opposed to bounce back, because for me, bouncing forward makes sure it makes sure that you think about what the learnings are, incorporate that, and then you move forward with it, as opposed to constantly looking back. Because as human beings, we love to do that. We love to think about the mistakes we've made. But what you really want to do is to capitalize on those mistakes, if they are mistakes, capitalize on the changes you want to make in terms of if you're looking forward without anything in terms of a mistake. It's pure strategy and ensuring that everyone comes along on that ride. What I mean by ride is that each employee, from the least of the Mohicans to the highest order in the organization, is consistent where that is concerned. These things become very, very important when you look forward. So our forward looking now is AI in the workplace. How does that impact? What is the accountable decisions around AI? Because again, you have people fearful of AI, but AI is like everything else. It is a tool to do your job. But what makes AI a little bit destructive is that how are you going to incorporate that in your decision making? Are you going to have employees, for example, relying 100% on AI? And if so, then you have to put things, policies and procedures in place to guide those things, right? You have, again, looking at the future, you would have remote work, hybrid work, and you have to be very intentional in your culture and how you assimilate your teams and how teams interact, because they may no longer have proximity as a strength, meaning that they are close together and so they can bond and easily do work and collaborate, etc. You have generational expectations. What do I mean by that? Most organizations now have generation X, Y, Z, millennium, baby boomers, all mixed up. And each one of those generations have different expectations of what ethics might be or what accountability looks like and what culture looks like. You have to ensure that you are in tandem with all these different generations and by which extension of that, different people existing. Communication constantly becomes important to understand the different needs. I'm sure some of us have young ones in our organization now. Their expectation on transparency is high, which means that your communication strategy to support your culture, to support your ethics, to support your accountability is going to be in demand. And you know, they love communication because they're always on their phone. How are you going to treat with those things? But again, you can use those things as a tool as opposed to looking at it as something that I have to manage and control. And then finally, one of the things that I've considered for future, and again, juxtaposing it against culture, ethics, accountability, is this thing called ESG. our investors are now demanding ESG reports. So how you treat with your environment for those who belong into the manufacturing and energy industries, how you treat with your social engagements, not just your internal employee engagements, but also your engagements with your different stakeholders, and of course, governance. And of course, this is where CCGI comes in, can be a major player in that regard. Governance, is not an abstract thing that belongs to boards anymore. It trickles down into the organization. And again, from the least of the Mohicans to the highest level. So I can go on and on. I think, Kamla, I think you told me I have 8 to 10 minutes, but I could take the whole session, right? So I'm just gonna say one thing is that when culture is progressive, employees are free. They are free to make decisions because you have outlined what responsible decision making is by virtue of your ethics and so on and your practice. And then your accountability is transparent. So it doesn't differentiate how you treat with an employee versus how you treat with a manager. So you are consistent. A little later on, I guess I can share some of the things that I think you can use to strengthen if you see any gaps and so on in the way that your organization is set up right now to treat with ethics, issues around ethics, culture, and of course, accountability. Yeah. So did I take my 8 minutes? I don't know if you're doing a time check, but I have a tendency to talk a lot because again, I'm passionate about this. So I'm just going to stop. And of course, if you want me to come back in, Sarona, I will.
Definitely. Thank you, Delia. Actually, you touched on so many things that I already had that was just, running through my mind. So of course, I could see that definitely everybody is going to be on the same level. We're talking about things that we're passionate about, things that we love, but also it just goes to show that all of the things that we do as professionals, it might seem as though it's just policies and procedures, but there are a lot of things that are just really embedded in some of us, our ethics and the way that we work. So thank you for that.
Yes.
Glyne, turning to you, with your extensive leadership experience in the financial sector and corporate governance, what do you believe are the most critical elements for organizations to focus on when it comes to culture and ethical behavior?
Okay, well, thanks for the question and thanks for having me. I would give Delia my 10 minutes if she wanted because I really was enjoying listening to her. So before you get to the question, I just wanted to sort of put us as Caribbean people into context because from my perspective, the Caribbean has always known what it means to build and rebuild in the face of uncertainty. And that to me is something that is part of us. We carry in our DNA something that's fundamental about resilience, that many other regions are still in the early shapes of learning because they haven't endured what we've endured. And even as Caribbean people, and if you think about our own upbringing and think about our houses where we grew up, there were no posted rules on the wall. There were no compliance manuals stuck to the refrigerator, but everyone who walked into our house, whether it was a friend or a family, they knew how to behave. You didn't walk through the house with your shoes on. You didn't eat and leave the kitchen before washing your dishes. And if you made a mess, you certainly didn't wait to be told to clean it up. You dealt with it yourself. Why? Because the culture of the Caribbean house was understood by us all. The ethics of respect and responsibility were lived, and accountability, well, let's just say that Caribbean mom looking at you across the room was enough to enforce the rules. There was no audit committee or anything that was required. So all that is said to say that my belief is that every Caribbean person has within them the tenets for good governance. And my belief is that every organization definitely operates on exactly the same principles as that Caribbean household, except that the resilience at the organizational level, it has to be built out, it has to be deliberate, it has to be consistent, and it has to be done before any crisis arises. And it's grounded in the three things that we mentioned, those three invisible forces, the culture, and the culture must tell the truth, ethics that hold under pressure, and accountability that functions even when it is inconvenient. And when those three are present and working well, things go well. But when those three things are weak, the organization may still look good from the outside, it may still look impressive, it may still have a strong brand, it may have beautiful offices, directives that are well respected, and all the manuals and frameworks in place. But underneath, it will be fragile. And so that's why today's topic around these three pillars is important, because it tells us exactly how we are supposed to act in the room to make sure that we develop resilient organizations. I'm not going to go back through what the pillars are. I think Delia did a good job, but I will just say briefly what they mean to me. And culture is how things really work around the organization, not how we say the word, not what's in the staff handbook, not what appears in value statements or the annual report. It's how the decisions are made, how the bad news is treated, how behavior is rewarded and which behavior is tolerated, and who is allowed to avoid consequences. Ethics is what we are prepared to do, or conversely, what we refuse to do, even when we can get away with it. Many people think that ethics is about avoiding illegality, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it is to make sure you're compliant. But the truth is that the ethical question often shows up long before the legal one. It appears when we ask ourselves, should we be doing this? And even if we can do it, is it the right thing to do? Who may be harmed? Are we being honest with our stakeholders? Are we shifting today's risk onto tomorrow's generation of company leaders? And the accountability is whether the consequences follow the decisions, conduct, and actions or inactions made. But it's not simply about blaming, name shaming, because those cultures make persons hide problems. Accountability is about ownership, responsibility, learning, and correction. And the unfortunate thing is that these three important pillars are sometimes treated as soft issues. Because when we speak about organizational resilience, we often think about the very visible things: capital, liquidity, technology, infrastructure, insurance, cyber systems, business continuity plans, those whole regime, audit reports, risk registers, etc. But these three pillars, they're really not soft issues. In a world of today, in a very volatile world, they're really a part of the internal architecture, I call it, that determines whether an organization breaks, whether it bends, whether it adapts, whether it recovers. Because when the real pressure comes on an organization, the deep test is what people do. They don't run to the manuals. They don't run and pull out chapter 3, verse 2. They do what the culture automatically allows them to do. They go back to the cultural side of things and the ethics that goes with that and the accountability standards of the organization. That's where we end up when the pressure is sitting. So then we have things like when the numbers are tight, when the costs are rising and margins are shrinking, when bad news appears. What do people do? Whatever they do is what the culture allows them to do. And that is when you then move from the theory into the reality. So in terms of what you asked about how do you treat those to make the organizations more resilient, what I want people to bear in mind is that a resilient organization is not one that never has problems because that organization doesn't exist. That's the reality. A resilient organization is one where people can raise problems early, where the uncomfortable information can reach the right people, and where the truth is not punished, but corrective action is taken before the issue becomes entrenched. So if a board never hears about problems, it should not be congratulating itself at all. Instead, it should be asking, where is no bad news reaching us? And that's where culture would answer that question. Because if people believe that raising concerns will damage their career, they will stay silent. If they think that the seniors in the organization are untouchable, they will stay silent. If they believe that the board does not want to hear the uncomfortable truths, they will stay silent. And if people believe that the organization generally prefers the appearance of good governance over the reality of good practice, they will stay silent. And that silence is dangerous. And I've seen this many a times because that silence then poses a significant risk to resilience because it can turn into a financial risk, a reputational risk, a safety risk. Because if they're not being surfaced, they're not being dealt with. And because of these potential risks, ethics then comes into place. And Delia would have mentioned how they're interlinked. And the reality is that they are interlinked because ethics is a big part of building the infrastructure and making it resilient. Ethics forces us to act not only if we can survive the day-to-day and the next month and the next quarter, but also acts if we're making decisions and acting in a manner that preserves the organization's ability to serve in the long term. And the truth in our region in particular is that failures often don't begin with a big act of dishonesty. It begins with some form of ethical failure. Sometimes it begins with politeness and not wanting to offend. It begins with silence because of who's speaking. It comes with conflict avoidance and with a deference to status because of the person's role in society or in the company or on the board. But regardless of however they start, the truth is that in the Caribbean, we have enough examples to remind us that governance failure is not theoretical. The examples differ in size and set and detail, and persons would have mentioned some today in terms of CLICO. We have some in recently around the cryptocurrency fraud that happened in Bahamas and Antigua. We had some around FIFA and Trinidad. So there really and truly exists across a different set of regimes, but there's a common thread that goes across all of them. And that is that the real damage is not only financial, the deeper damage is the damage to trust. And trust is the currency of governance in my mind, because without trust, the employees stop speaking honestly, the customers stop believing promises, investors demand a higher risk premium, and regulators become just a whole lot more intrusive, and communities become suspicious. And so accountability then ties into that, because rebuilding that trust is why accountability exists. And I want you to bear in mind that the true test of accountability is not how the organization treats the junior employee who breaches policy, because this is common. The juniors, unfortunately, are the ones that we love to show accountability works. But the true test is, how do we treat the high performer, the CEO, the board chair, or an influential director, a politically connected person, or the person in the room that everyone's afraid to challenge? That's when you see that accountability is really showing up. A no consequence culture for those in that group is dangerous, as it tells onlookers that standards are optional and that rules only apply downward. And that then sends a signal to all that are watching that the organization doesn't have accountability. It has a hierarchy, and that's a dangerous signal to stakeholders. So as we need the healthy accountability to send the right signals, the questions that we need to be asking is, who made the decision? What information did they rely on? Who challenged it? Who should have known? What was done when the warning signals appeared? What changed after the event happened? And even more so in today's world, boards have to be able to ask, what did we know about the external environment? What did we choose not to examine and why? What early warnings did we dismiss? What assumptions did we fail to test? And what risks did we kick down the road because dealing with those risks today was inconvenient or not favorable? And those are the courageous questions that have to be asked. But the truth is that ensuring organizational resilience requires courageous questions, because in our region, trust, once it's damaged, is difficult to rebuild. And when the storm comes, whether that's financial, reputational, or whatever, the organization will not rise to the level of its policy manual. It will rise to the level of its culture, its ethics, and its accountability standards that permeate the organization. So I sum that all to say that, to me, culture is not what we say at the retreat. Ethics is not what we write in the code of conduct, and accountability is not what we promise after a scandal hits. Instead, culture is what people are allowed to do repeatedly. Ethics is what people choose when there's a cost to doing the right things. And accountability is what happens after the choice is made. And resilience that we are speaking about and that we want to attain, resilience is the result of those choices being done correctly over and over and over again. And so I will pause there, because I believe my time is up. I'd like Delia, this is a topic I love, and I could go on, but I will pause there and come back as needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Yes, I know we could just go on and on about absolutely everything here, but thank you. So Simone, we'd like to invite you to share your perspective on the topic as well.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sarona. And I really want to say a very, very, very big thank you to Kamla and the CCGI for inviting me back again. I was just kind of reflecting to myself that over the years I've been involved with the CCGI, all the themes that we've had to talk about have a lot to do with volatility and uncertainty in the world, right? I think the first time I ever learned the term VUCA, volatile, uncertain, what was the C for again, Kamla? I can't remember. Kamla taught me that phrase. And I think it's
complexity and uncertainty.
complexity. Thank you very much. So Kamla taught me the term VUCA, which I clearly forgot after, but I didn't forget the principle behind it. And I mean, I think it's just very much a reflection of the world that we're living in post-pandemic. I mean, I think we thought at the time that the pandemic was the worst of our concerns, only to come out of that into a world that I think presents new challenges every single day. Both from a climate change perspective as well as politically, geopolitically. I really want to commend Kamla, first of all, and the CCGI for continuing to stay on top of like the most relevant topics that concern us in the region and I think worldwide. So thanks for having me, and also thanks for all the participants who are still here at 5:30. If that's not resilience, I don't know what is. I really also am excited to be on this panel because, as the previous speaker said, it's something that we could talk about forever and ever. I just raised the time. We won't do that, I promise. But it's great to be on a panel with such passionate speakers who bring different perspectives. I was very happy to hear from Delia, being an HR expert, and then Glyne from a more kind of financial services perspective, in terms of overall governance and leadership. I think the perspectives are extremely valuable, and I feel very lucky to be part of this panel. So I don't want to. So everything that's been said by the panelists that came previously, I don't think I could agree more. I mean, all the points were extremely well made and very clear. And I certainly don't want to repeat a lot of what has been said, but forgive me if some of the themes do touch, because I think we're probably all very much on the same page when it comes to a lot of these issues. But I really wanted to focus, and I think I'll maybe can play a bit of a role in kind of pulling together everything that's been said before and then adding a few additional thoughts. But I really wanted to kind of focus my 8 minutes on three themes. And one is, when we talk about culture, what kind of culture are we talking about, right? And without a doubt, previous speakers have touched on this and been very clear about this. But what kind of culture are we talking about? Because I feel like certainly in the world post-pandemic, there's a lot to talk about a culture of resilience. What does that actually mean? Two, I also wanted to talk a little bit, what's the timing to do this? Like, when does one do this? We're in the midst of this uncertain time, things can change tomorrow. They're changing every day. What is the time to sort of really work on embedding this culture? And then the third point I wanted to make is to say why I feel very strongly that however it is that we phrase or frame this culture of resilience, it has to be put people first. It has to have put people first at the heart of it, because at the end of the day, you're only as resilient as your people. The organization is only as resilient as the people, right? So on the first point, what kind of culture are we talking about? Well, this whole thing of like culture of resilience and, how do we develop this strong culture of resilience? I think it's certainly a worthwhile consideration, right? We have a lot of organizations that are going to the whiteboard, after with their boards after the pandemic to talk about, how do we make sure that our culture is tailored to deal with times of uncertainty? How does it do that? And I think that's great, and that's really important work. But the point I wanted to make today is that if you've not actually kind of done that yourself, if your organization hasn't gone through that process and you haven't, kind of had this whiteboard session where you're using all these catchphrases around VUCA and resilience and pivoting and all of that, my personal view is that if you have a ethics-based culture, a culture of, and I'm going to lump the three concepts together a little bit, so forgive me for doing that, because I think Delia did such an excellent job of just explaining what each component represents and what they mean. But I think, I'll take a little liberty in lumping them together and talking a bit about a culture of ethics and accountability. And my view is that if you have a values-based culture which is all about ethics and accountability, fairness, transparency, integrity, all these foundational values that we believe in, then you have a culture of resilience, right? Because, and I was very happy to hear Glyne make the comment about Caribbean households, because I also had a similar reaction when I looked at the topic. And I thought, when I think about values, I can't help but think about a Caribbean household, because the way I feel about a culture of integrity and ethics and values being a culture of resilience is very much, I think of the words of many of our Caribbean elders when they say to us, just know who you are and your values will guide you through. And that's something that I also believe in terms of organizations. If you know who you are and if you know what you stand for, your values will guide you through times of uncertainty and take you through and for the long run. And so, to me, if you have a strong values-based culture, you've already done the work in terms of making sure that you have a culture of resilience. And why is that? Well, any values-based culture certainly will help you to define what's your purpose? What do you actually stand for? And that's something that every team member in an organization, both your internal and external stakeholders need to go into any crisis or any time of uncertainty knowing that already. What do you actually stand for? You need to know that, because that's what's going to pilot you through times of uncertainty. The other one is that, again, we talk about integrity. Why is integrity so important? Well, we know it's important because in times of crisis, there are going to be pressures to cut corners. There are going to be pressures to do all sorts of things, make decisions that solve an immediate problem, but maybe they don't really adhere to your systems of values. So guess what? You need to make sure that you have a culture of integrity, because that's going to push you right through and make sure that the decisions that you take in times of crisis are decisions that you take according to the compass that you want your business to follow. The same thing, this theme came up, I think, with the other speakers as well, fairness. There is no more important time for you to have a culture of fairness than in a crisis. You have to have it all the time, but the point is that in a crisis where all the systems are tested, this is the moment at which your team is watching more keenly than ever before. How are decisions being made? How are things being done? Who's carrying the burden at a time like this? And Glyne made a really, really important comment about who it is that we hold accountable in an organization, making sure that everybody is held accountable equally. And that's really, really important, because going into a crisis, if people don't really understand that inherently and understand that, well, listen, this risk is not, this difficulty has come up, and it's not going to be a matter of just chopping, the easiest people or letting them take the fall for something. We go into this crisis understanding that, well, this is the way in which things are operate, and no matter what, I understand that the organization will not only operate fairly towards external stakeholders, but they'll also treat me fairly as a team member. So that's very, very important. I think that earlier, I believe Delia had talked a bit about adaptability, right? And again, that's an important part of a values-based culture, because how is it part of a culture of ethics? Well, learning from mistakes means being honest about who made them, right? And how they were made. So if you don't have that kind of values-based culture where people can actually talk openly and freely and with safety about how mistakes are made, how are you going to learn from them? So those are all things that even if you didn't use some sort of catchphrases or, what have you, about how it is that you approach resilience, the point is that any basic culture of ethics and integrity and fairness will have those as part of the framework. And it will help you with adaptability, it will help you with in terms of understanding how it is that you handle those situations. And then I think we talked extensively about trust, which is really, really critical. It's critical day to day, but certainly in the face of a crisis, it becomes more critical than ever. So Glyne talked about and Delia talked about it, and I simply can't agree enough. And a values-based culture will help to engender trust, because then, your team members will understand that, they can trust you to operate in a certain way, to operate with fairness and integrity. When trust exists, people are more likely to stay committed as well. So they can count on you to operate in a particular way through the crisis. So on that point, again, I would just repeat that I really do think that, if you have a values-based culture, you've already set your business up for success in terms of resilience and longevity, because those are, in my view, are very much the ingredients that are required. And then, Glenn had talked about this before. When is the time to do this work? Glenn talked a bit about making sure these things are embedded day to day, and it's not just a function of the annual report or the team retreat. And I simply could not agree with him enough, because at the end of the day, your culture is not going to be built by documentation. Documentation is a start. You start with your policy, but what makes it culture is how much your team sees it happening in front of them. Are you walking the walk? Can they expect that these are the values that you actually represent day to day? Does it guide how decisions are taken? Does it guide how you actually lead? So, and I think a lot of organizations will make the mistake of, putting things on paper, but they don't live the values that they put on paper. And that's really, really critical. But the time to do it is not at the time of the crisis. The time to do it is always, it's every day, because I very much see culture as a muscle. And it's one that you simply have to exercise every day. Beyond, yes, you do the annual report, Glenn. Without a doubt, you do the retreat. For sure, you have it on paper, but 100%, you have to be living these values every single day. And that's really, really critical, because in the time of a crisis, you simply don't have time to embed any of these things. At the time of the crisis is when all of these systems and processes and values are tested. Remember that in uncertainty, people's imaginations will run wild. And if you don't kind of start out a period of adversity or difficulty, understanding that these are the truths that I hold to be certain of the organization I work with, it is simply too late to try to embed them then. It is the work of day-to-day, constant living of these values and embedding of these values. You take it to the gym every day. I know it's summer and everybody wants to have, be in shape for the summer, but you can't look at crisis preparation in that way. It's not going to be the same as the swimsuit in the summer. It's something that you have to make sure that you're fit and you're going to the gym every single day and all year round. And that's exactly how you develop your culture. Because again, those systems will be tested. And many of them, even the ones that are most deeply embedded, some of them also fail, right? Because they're under extreme stress at a time of crisis. So the time to do that work is immediately. And the third point I really wanted to touch on quickly is the role of people. It's extremely critical. You have to have a people first culture. The organization is only resilient if the people are resilient. In a crisis, it's your team that carries the organization. There's just simply no question about this. You cannot do it without your team. It has to be people centered. It has to be a muscle that you've built over time. And that's in a number of ways. Organizations need to ask themselves, was I committed to my team's wellness all along? How am I looking at their health and their wellness? Is it preventative or is it curative? And that's for two reasons. One is that you need to make sure that you are investing in the wellness of your team for the sake of simple wellness. You want to have team members who are well, who feel safe, and who are cared for. You want that as a means to an end in itself. But for a second reason, the truth is that team members who feel valued and cared for by an organization in a time of crisis will show up for you in times of uncertainty, because we can't lose track of the fact that our teams are also being tested on a personal level during these times. And I don't think we saw a clearer example of that than during COVID, when people were under extreme personal stress and strain, and we still expected them to be a part of the word that I got very, very tired of hearing in 2020, the pivot of the organization. Right. So if you have not been investing in your team all along, and you suddenly turn up and say, "Oh, I care, and we want to distribute this to you, or want to provide this sort of help to you," it's not going to ring as authentic whatsoever. You need to carry your team on a journey. So when things get difficult, they know what your role is in their lives, and they understand they feel that sense of loyalty towards the organization. And the other one is a really important one that I think Delia and Glyne also touched on, which is psychological safety. Are you building a culture that has a key component of it, psychological safety? And that's really important, because it comes back to Delia's point about making mistakes, and can people are you in a place where you can be open to talk about how mistakes are made so that you can learn from them? But, at a time of crisis, you're really going to require leadership is torn in 1,000 different directions in a time of crisis. So you're going to need your team to catch you. You're not going to see everything. You're going to need them to catch you, and you're going to need them to be very open with you about some of the challenges that they're seeing around them. Have you created a culture of psychological safety where people feel that they can bring these issues up and talk about things openly without fear of reprisal? And that again goes back to the fairness, the transparency of the kind of organization that you have built over time. One in which, as Glenn said, you are not penalizing only some people, but not others. And the third final point I'd make there, which is also a bit connected to psychological safety, is whether you have also created a culture that allows your team space to innovate, because you're going to need them to be putting on their innovation hats during a time of crisis as well.
Thank you, Simone.
Sure.
Yes, definitely. I agree with you. I could actually listen to both you and Delia, of course, every day, all day. And it's quite clear that, while each of you brings some very unique perspectives in terms of, your role and your function, we could see that there are definitely some very common themes in terms of our discussion around leadership, organizational culture, ethics, and accountability. So, just building on that, I'd like to see that we could consider, if there's anything that you guys would have heard that we can challenge or we can add. Now is the opportunity for us to, just do a deep dive on this and, just try to extend the conversation.
Sorry, Sarona, my internet just dropped a little bit. What did you say in the last? You wanted us to do what exactly?
Right. So let's do a deep dive into, just tackling some of the challenges that we would see, on what I specifically probably want to do is do in terms of boards. There are a lot of conflict or a lot of uncertainty when it comes to boards being involved in this aspect of it, because sometimes, you have people just taking themselves out of it. So how do you see boards becoming more responsible when it comes to culture and ethics?
Okay, if I may start off first, Simone and Glenn, what I will say is where I would have practiced before, as part of the HR agenda for the organization, HR actually took culture on. And so what we would do in terms of our goals for the year or any specific year or as part of our strategy for 3-4 years, we will build in certain aspects of it and to ensure that the culture of the organization is honed in, it's practiced, it evolves, whatever it is that we decide that this is what it's going to do. So it becomes part of the agenda of HR and it is reported into the board and specifically the HR subcommittee of the board, so that you are held accountable via that. So I'll give you an example. The core values, and Simone talked about it, values, the core values of the organization, and in several of the organizations I've worked in, we would take that and make that part of your performance management process. So you are accountable for delivering hard targets, whether it's sales, finance, etc. But you are also accountable to demonstrating the core values of the organization via what we call behavioral competencies. And those are managed on an annual basis. It's assessed and it becomes part of the reward system by virtue of your merit increases, etc. What we'll also do, I'll just give 2 more examples of that because again, I could go to town on this for the remainder of the session and that will be unfair. What we will also do are cultural audits specific to the topics that are in the organization and requires management. What we will do with those audits, though, it's looking forward, not looking back, so that you are tied to, yes, the issues of the organization, but you're also tied to the future focus of the organization. Whatever comes out of that in terms of if there are gaps to be identified and addressed, that becomes part of the leadership accountability, not just HR. And that goes into your performance goals on the soft side, not the hard side. And again, that's how you get transparency because it starts with the leadership, but it's trickled down to every level in the organization. That includes simple things, I'm telling you, simple as team meetings every month. And those team meetings are intentional because it covers the specific topics, areas of concern, areas of learning, things to be innovative on. So again, the audits allows you to keep focus forward, but also allows everyone to be part of that system and ownership. And girl, I'm telling you, I could go down the, I have like 15. But that's, I'll just give 2 examples of it. It's really important that your performance management system is, and all those outcomes are channeled into the board. It becomes part of your HR agenda. It's part of the HR subcommittee or overlook and oversight and goes into the wider board. So I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Delia. So Glyne, Delia emphasized on the importance of shaping organizational culture to leadership. And, what stood out to you and how do you think that these could work together in practice? Because of course we can talk about it, but how do we put it into practice?
Okay, so I do agree with Delia, and there are 2 aspects of leadership in terms of where the board sits. One is the board leadership itself inside the boardroom, how we treat into each other, how we treat into the real issues. And the second one is leadership through the CEO down to management through the employee, which is the CEO. So first I'll touch on the matter of the leadership in the boardroom. And I think that one of the big things that needs to happen in the boardroom is that boards need to escalate the conversations that they're having. Too often we're having boards that are having operational discussions and things that should be dealt with by management, and they're consuming the times of the board. And in reality, the board should really and truly be focusing on those big ticket items, those strategic matters, those things that are future looking. And the numbers are, and I always tell people, if we use the imagery of a car, the reason that we have a big windscreen and a small rear view mirror is very important because you need to keep looking forward to get to your destination. And the rear view mirror allows you to do your safety checks and to see what's coming and what's happening behind you. But your bigger focus must be on where are we going. And too much time is spent in the boardroom dealing with the historic items. Yes, things have happened. Now your mandate of management must be, why did it happen? How are we going to fix it? And what are you going to put into place to make sure that it doesn't repeat itself, or if it was a good thing, that it does repeat itself? And in the boardroom, that also means that the chair must run an effective meeting where there's a quality of challenge within the room. And too often boards are sinking into groupthink. They're sinking into silos of silence by some directors, and there's a dominant voice in the room that becomes the one that carries the vote and becomes the one that carries the conversation. And the boardroom cannot be a place where this happens, because the strength of a board is the diversity of views that leads to richness in conversation, and then to a quality of vote that is for the best betterment of the organization. So the board and directors must be willing to ask the questions: what are we missing? What could go wrong? Who disagrees? What does the data say? What are we not being told? And what would this decision look like if it appeared on the front page tomorrow? And that's the conversation that the board chair has to be able to evoke from their directors and also from the CEO, not the deep down data crunch in terms of how many accounts was this, or how was the customer service. That's management's realm. The board's view is to be able to pull the level of conversation up that you're asking the big ticket question. And the second one, as it relates to the board and the management, I completely agree with the culture survey. And this is something that I found to work very well in terms of having focused culture surveys, because culture is not measured only by the staff surveys and the statements, as I said before, but you have to have a very pinpoint focus on what are the things that we need to know about which could impact us, that we need to be able to navigate as we move forward. So things like, what are the behaviors that get rewarded? Staff know what the bad behaviors are. They know what the blind spots are. And if you can have anonymous surveys that allow people to surface these, and then their plans them to be able to bring them into a corrected state, that builds confidence in the staff, which then allows them to be able to surface more items. So the culture surveys and the right questions, those are the type of things that the board can put on their agenda as the big ticket items to be able to discuss to move the organization forward as we speak about being more resilient. So things like what gets rewarded, what the behaviors that get excused, what are the deep issues that keep recurring that are not being paid attention to. And you're not going to overload the surveys, but you're going to deal with one specific item at a time, fix it, and then move to the next. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Glenn. Simone, how can boards and executive leadership work together to embed a culture of accountability throughout an organization rather than treating it as a compliance exercise?
So I realized I was muted. Yeah, I mean, I do think that, the points that the previous speakers brought up are very important here, because I do think that a lot of what is being said is that we need to kind of take this conversation out of just sort of compliance and box checking into a culture, which is something that you live and breathe every single day. And I think that, how do boards and management hold themselves accountable for doing this? I think that's the first step, is that you need to think of it from that kind of perspective, that it is more than just this box checking exercise, or do you have a related parties form, or what have you, but really looking at all the signs around you of what kind of culture you are really embedding around you. And I think that for the board perspective, I think one of the things that they need to hold management accountable for is, who is the champion of this on the executive team? Is there a role that's responsible for culture? Because I really do think that that's a critical thing. You need to have an owner for it. In many cases, it may be HR. Sometimes it's, these other kind of more hybrid roles or so on. But I think after kind of shifting to understand that, look, we're going much deeper than just simply compliance and box checking. We are talking about organizational culture. Then the second question is, who's responsible for that in the management team? And then, as we look at that kind of accountability framework from a board perspective, Delia had raised this before. Which committee is going to be responsible for doing a deep dive on this? Is it the governance committee? Is it the HR committee? It needs to have a home. So you need to have a responsible person on the management team. It needs to have a home. It needs to have a champion on the board, right? So again, your board composition becomes very, very important. This is really something that's important to you. Who is the champion of this, of that, who is the chairman or chairperson of that particular committee? And then I think Delia did a really good job earlier of raising a lot of the frameworks that you can use to test for whether this is in fact true, right? What are the metrics by which you measure this across management? So these are some of the questions, and Glenn had raised, the board knowing what to ask and asking critical and probing questions. But I do think that the starting point is ownership and making sure that who is the champion of this thing. And, I think I would probably go one level even before and say, as you appoint a champion of this, whoever it is, and you decide which committee it falls under and so on, I think it's really important for organizations to be very authentic about the kind of culture that they curate. Because if you don't really believe in it, it is going to be a box checking exercise. And as much as some of these values we think that they hold true no matter what. I mean, trust is trust is trust. Integrity is integrity, right? I mean, there's not a lot of nuance around that. But the truth is that the way that you package and communicate this whole system of values, there is a lot of nuance around that. And you need to understand, organizations really do need to understand, who am I talking to with this conversation? How do I best tailor it for the kind of organization that I have? What's really genuinely authentic to me? What in this am I doing to check a box? If I'm checking a box, do I really want to check that box? We really do need to kind of get away from this sort of adopting these off-the-shelf solutions and white label solutions. You can start with one. There's nothing wrong with getting your AI-generated policy, but I want to really encourage organizations that whatever you start with, whatever precedent, or you need to prosecute that document very, very heavily and make sure that it reflects your authentic values. Because you have to believe it. And if you don't believe it, then everything else that goes from that point, finding the champion, putting it on the board's agenda, putting it on in a committee, all of that will ring inauthentic, and you won't succeed. So you really need to find a culture that you actually do believe in and that you can put your stamp on. And I think the rest of it will flow from there.
And if I could just add to that, because I think it's important for us to realize that yes, governance and great governance is good for the organization, good for associations, but the reality is not every board wants good governance. Not every director wants good governance, and that's a real reality and one of the hard challenges that we have to face in the Caribbean, because good governance moves the organization sometimes to places where we find that we get to a point where our existing directors may not be fit for purpose. And what does that then mean? We have to look for persons that then come in to replace the same directors. So it is a hard conversation, and that's where things like the same board assessments come into play to understand what are we doing as a board, how are we achieving, what was our mandate, did we achieve this mandate, are individual directors stepping up, are there individual directors that are failing, and the conversations that have to happen in the room outside of the business of the organization has to be around the business of the board, because sometimes poor governance suits boards to make sure that they stay in the conundrum that they're in because that is what they want. And that is one of the realities that we have to face. And that's a conversation that a fit chair would have to have with his board and in terms of with his stakeholders to say, well, look, here's the issue. Because the issue isn't always management. The issue isn't always what happens in the business. The issue sometimes is what happens in the boardroom and why is it happening. And the conversations that have to happen there are not always going to happen because it's a hard conversation to have.
Yes, agreed, totally. So I see that we're gonna just open up for some questions. And of course, you guys can put up your virtual hands and unmute your mics.
Right, and you have a virtual hand from Colin at the moment. So Colin Supanchow, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question. And Sarona, there's some comments in the chat. If you can see them, you can go to it next. Right, Colin?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kamla, and thanks a lot to the presenters. So my comments brief to some extent. I put up a point in here is that I think this issue of culture, ethics, and accountability is very, from my experience, very heavily dependent on the leadership conviction. And I use that word conviction very carefully, right? Because certainly from my experience working across different markets, when the CEO really has the right balance and equilibrium in the way that they manage their team and the way they select their team, I think you begin to see those attributes sort of going through the organization. Okay, I think the issue that CEOs face, and this is an interesting part of it, because in some cases I don't think it's malintent, it's poor leadership. Particularly in public companies, you have a reporting requirement every 90 days. You have shareholders that you need to get in front of. You have an investor presentation that you need to be able to submit. And when you have to make tough decisions that may have short-term consequences for the business, the question that arises is, what sort of trade-offs exist, right? And are we going to make a decision that will benefit us in the short term, but in the medium to long term, it may not be in the right decision for the business. In other words, sacrifice to some extent. You may call it a cultural issue, an ethical issue to some extent. In my experience, some of these things are not as black and white as it may appear to be, right? So there's some room to be able to wiggle, if I could use that term, right? So I think my first comment is that the CEO plays a very big role in this. I think at board levels, my experience is a big part of the discussion is that board members have different outlooks. So some of them are operationally oriented. They love to go into detail. Other board members are really very much up in the helicopter. And I think finding that appropriate equilibrium is also important inside a day. In other words, and that's where the role of the chairman becomes very important, to give people a say, but at the same point in time, you have to control the dynamic in the boardroom. You can't have a meeting going for 6 hours and you're not landing anywhere, right? You need to be able to make sure that you are landing in the right place, right? And then I think the big picture is that, when we talk about these matters, right? I think boards are typically trying to think through how to plan for the upside and how to protect the downside. Okay, but that's a difficult area to navigate in today's world. That's very, very difficult, right? Okay, to navigate in the big world, and that risk management is therefore really closely intertwined with strategy, and strategy in most cases is all about growth. I know it I know it involves other aspects, but enablers and so forth, right? But if you cut to the chase, it's all about how do we grow the business? How do we double the size of the business, right? Okay. And therefore, the issue that I'm talking about when we talk about accountability, because that's another big component, right? We have three words in here: culture, ethics, and accountability. When my experience on boards is that strategy and risk is closely interconnected, right? And when things go wrong, the board and the CEO may have been involved in making certain decisions that have not worked out as we wanted to work out. How many of us have sat on boards that have approved significant inorganic activity, where when we take control, the financial projections that support it are often very different to the actual realities, and the actual realities are often a lot worse. Does the organization really do a good postmortem? Does the organization really look at that and not pinpoint somebody using the word accountability and saying, Colin, you made the error, you have to go? But does the organization really look deeply at what has happened in there, right? And really sort of try to address those types of issues, right? Those are issues that I think are really, really important. And then when I think of culture, this whole area around performance management, rewards, and all of this whole area around culture and execution is again
Are we losing or it's us?
This area around, I don't know if it's my Wi-Fi, right? So my last comment is the whole area of culture and execution is closely intertwined in my view, so that organizations that have very good cultures, very strong cultures, very high accountability, good transparency, good ethics, you will tend to find they will get to the root cause of the issue, they will resolve the issue, they will mitigate the risk, they will take all of those things into account, and they will execute on balance more successfully and more rapidly. So I think these are complex areas, from my experience, are not easy to talk about and a little more difficult to put into place, right? There's some obvious situations that arise from time to time that need to be addressed, right? But what I'm trying to talk about is what falls between the cracks is not the simplest thing to resolve. Okay.
Thanks so much, Colin. Sarona, I had a question which I wanted to ask the panelists. And it's one question, so all three can take it from their perspective, or one person, because, whichever. But the PwC report on the corporate governance survey in the Caribbean recently, their latest report, showed that directors, about 46% only felt they understood the culture of the organization. What does that mean? If only 46% of directors understood the culture of the organization or had a sense even, I don't think the word was as strong as they understood it. What does that mean about the role of that board in setting the culture of the organization?
Well, go ahead. I'll defer to ladies first.
Okay, what I was going to say is I didn't see the reports. Let me start with that, unfortunately. But just to take you for what you just said, if the board doesn't understand the culture of the organization, then I would even go back before that and say, was the board properly onboarded in the first case on the organization, about the organization? And this, again, is not a dollars and cents discussion. It is about the muscle of the organization, what carries the organization, your systems, your processes, your take on the core values of the organization. All organizations, I'm sure, has core values. And starring in the middle of that is integrity and ethics. Always. You will always find those two words. So I would go back to say, were they even on board? And if they weren't, were they asking the questions to determine what that is? Now, I think as Colin said, it's a responsibility. Culture is a responsibility across the board. And while I agree with that, I do think that the responsibility of breaking down what that looks like belongs with the people who owns people, and that has to be HR. And I'm not going to, I make no apology for saying that, because that's a fact. And the whole sinew around that, the whole framework, however you want to put it, it has to come through the board HR subcommittee. And the board, the person who who sits on that committee as the chairperson of that committee is the one who is supposed to be asking those questions and ensuring if it's absent that it's incorporated and reported on and discussed, because that's where the breakdown, I think, comes. And the breakdown is not a big breakdown. It starts with really small things, the everyday conversations. Breakdown starts there. And then it transcends into things you don't want it to transcend, which I have also seen. So I'll end there. Glenn, I'm sorry. I think you were going to answer as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so you basically touched on it. I would say that that is not just a governance concern. That really and truly is a concern that the board is disconnected. Because if a board truly understands its mandate and understands how it's supposed to function, it understands that the things that drive the organization are the things that must engage them as a board. And one of the biggest things that drives the organization is the organizational culture that affects performance, that affects motivation, that affects how leaderships lead. And Colin raised the point in terms of the CEO and the tone that the CEO sets. And that, if the board is not doing it, is what becomes the culture and the tone of the organization. So any board that's coming in must be able to speak to the CEO, to get an orientation as new members come on, and to annually have a touch feel of what is the tone that we're having here, because that would then impact the results that they get and the growth, etc. So I think that the issue becomes more than not understanding the culture. It's a bigger one in terms of, are we connected as a board? Are we understanding our mandate? Are we asking the right questions? Because that is a symptom. So the not understanding the culture is a symptom. The not getting the results is a symptom. The real issue is that as a board, we're not doing what we were put into place to do, and that becomes the bigger problem.
That's it, because a lot of directors are comfortable with the expression of the tone being set at the top. But I'm not sure that they understand that the tone does not stay at the top. So, and how do you know what is the tone that penetrates through the organization? And recently I heard someone say, well, the board is separate, that's management's role. But my belief is if the board sets the tone, then the board need to know what is the tone that has been set, that's been adopted within the organization. And since culture, and all three panelists made such a great point about this, your culture is so important, it makes every difference. Delia said, not just eating strategy for breakfast, it eats it for lunch and dinner too, because your culture determines exactly how you move in good times and bad. And in bad times, when you critically need people to make the best decisions in the interest of the organization, if you don't know what your culture is, it means you have not determined that culture. You have not set it. So do you guys find that the directors who still continue to have that perspective that they sit in the boardroom, but what happens in the organization, they don't need to know any of that. It's just what comes to them through the CEO?
And I'll just respond, Kamla, on that and on the PwC. Sir, I also didn't read the report. But it's, to me, that's a very concern, because my question would be, having now said in the PwC regional wide survey or whatever, this is, what did you then go and do about it? Because you kind of need to do something about it, because that's a problem. I mean, it's fairly fundamental. And it's one thing for PwC to sort of do this temperature check to see how people are responding to their boards all around, how's governance working in the Caribbean. But this is an actual problem that you now need to sort out in the organization. I mean, do you have frameworks for this to be done? Who is responsible for doing this? Because if you don't know, my second question would be, do the people who work here know?
And that's just my thing. I think a lot of those directors who answered that way, they did not know that they ought to know.
But if you check that box and said, I don't know, on the PwC thing, you should have been rushing back to the CEO to say, listen, we have our chairman, we have a problem here. Because that's not something you say, boy, I don't know, and then you roll out and, have a cup of coffee and that's the end of the day. That is an actual problem.
Well, to be fair, I also think that the problem that's being surfaced in terms of not knowing is part of a bigger problem in terms of information overload as well. And we need to get to a stage, because the reality is that directors more often than not are coming off a full-time job as well. There are very few professional directors that are just doing that, and that's the only thing they're doing. So the issue of not knowing is also part of the issue of not reading, not being up to date for meetings, not being able to digest the information that's coming, and not having the time/opportunity to be able to speak to management to say, okay, outside of the meeting, can I chat with you about this, because I need to understand it better. It was mentioned in an earlier session today. I didn't understand why someone wanted an urgent discussion and an urgent approval, so I had to call and say, can you help me please? And after understanding, then I was able to act. The reality is that not everyone is doing that. So you're looking at board packs now because of the micro stuff that's inserted rather than just informational infographics or whatever. You're ending up with packs that are hundreds of pages. And this is coming out a week before, at best, because of the volume of information that's there that's being requested. How do you ideally read hundreds of pages, do your own personal life, do your own work life, and still be expected to be able to work in an effective manner? And I think we need to reel back, and we need to look and say, what is it that we are just asking for sake? And this is where management comes into play as well, because the CEO's role is not just a pass through. The CEO's role is to be able to represent the organization on the important matters in the boardroom. And if you're getting into the micro stuff in the boardroom, how many rolls of toilet paper, where the operational expense is up by $100 when your overall asset base is millions, the wrong conversations are happening. So the CEO has to force that conversation in terms of, how can I give you the right information about the right things at the right time, so that we're dealing with things like this. This is what our culture is. This is what our next year plan is. This is where we are as it relates to the key risks, not the small ticket items. So unfortunately, and I think Colin said it earlier, persons become in a self-preservation mode, because you know what? If I don't get certain things to happen, my job is at risk. So do I dare to have this big conversation? Maybe not. Maybe I'll just stay in my corner and give them what they want, and we go from there. So we do need to look at the whole matter. And again, this is where the Institute can play a big part in continuing what you're doing, because the education has to happen on both sides. It requires open-mindedness. It requires the ability to be able to step back and say, you know what, maybe I do need to look at this afresh. But the reality is that we're operating in 2026 in the 2006 manner, and it's just not sustainable.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Just to remind everyone, Monique has put the survey link in the chat. So we would like all of you, please, all of you, and we have 40 people in the room now. So we would like all of you to please give us your feedback. If you have not done so for today, you can include any thoughts that you want to share in summary, so that we have you know, some of your perspective in terms of whether we have met your expectations or so. Now, I see Roland Bertrand has put a comment in the chat. And Roland, I want to challenge that comment, because he's saying, from my perspective, culture is so important to the success of the company that it must be owned and championed by the CEO. I believe championed by the CEO, yes, but truly culture has to be owned by the board. In my view, the board sets the tone in how it treats with management. The board needs to be very much involved in ensuring that the right culture is set in the organization. Now, of course, the CEO can do that. If the board is not playing its part, the CEO can set the type of culture that helps ensure the success of the organization. But when you are looking at governance and the responsibility of the board, I think directors need to see that they have a responsibility to understand the tone that they are setting, to understand that that tone is the culture that you encounter in the body of the organization, in terms of how people perform, their ability to deliver on expectations of stakeholders, and all the things that we expect that organizations do on a day-to-day basis that carries the long-term direction of the organization. So,
would you like me to comment?
Yeah, actually, yes, I would give the opportunity, Roland, to give your feedback. And let me also say we are at 7:21, so we have 10 minutes more in today's session.
Well,
And I see that
my
Derek has
response would
agreed
be,
with you. Yeah, because he's saying a board interfaces with an organization is too limited a manner to understand, much less only culture. So that's Derek's perspective.
that's my point.
Let's hear yours. Yes.
The day-to-day sustenance or promulgation of a culture cannot be done by a board. And the board's responsibility is to hire and fire the CEO. So while the board sets culture, governance, ethics, accountability in terms of the standards that they want, the person who implements and champions that is the CEO. And that person must own the culture, ensure and be accountable for the culture to ensure success for the organization. That's my view.
Okay,
So
and
Kamla,
we can agree to disagree because I believe that the CEO should champion, but that it is important for the board to set. And if the CEO is not championing in the way that gives the outcome that the boards want, then that's the board's responsibility to ensure that you have a CEO who is doing that. But
Yeah.
Glyne,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
share
So
something.
just want to
Yes,
make a
Glenn.
comment because I think Darren made a valid point, which sort of substantiated what you said, because Derek said that the board was set. So that's what you're saying, but they're setting, but the champion and the executing has to happen on the management side. So, but what I would say, even in terms of setting, I agree that there must be a hybrid approach because neither side owns it. And the board is a continuum, so there will always be a board that's in place, and the board determines in conjunction with the CEO what's the type of company they want to have. So rather than either party saying, well, I'm setting the culture, the reality is that there should be joint sessions between both the board and not only the CEO, but management in general, the senior management. You sit together and you say, what's the type of organization we want to have? It's similar to the strategic plan and the strategy for the organization for the next 3 years. One person doesn't determine that. That is a culmination of a multiplicity of ideas. And the same thing happens with culture. Culture is defined after coming to a consensus because it's a determined act that will chart the way forward for the organization along a certain set of behaviors. And that set of behaviors is not viewed through one lens. It's viewed through various lenses coming from management, coming from the board, coming from independent parties sometimes who are major stakeholders. So I think that we have moved past where one person or one body sets it, and we're now at a stage where there have to be stakeholder groups that look and see, well, as a viable contributor to this organization, what are my views and perspectives, and how does that sort of tie into where we want to get to? And that then comes into a potpourri of ideas that is then assimilated into one concrete, yes, we can all agree on this. This is what we see as our culture and sign off on it. And then, as Derek has said, that's then championed by the CEO. Thanks.
Yeah, I said so because I don't want to absolve the CEO of responsibility, which I have seen that says, the board is responsible for culture or HR is responsible for culture.
That's
The
right.
CEO must take ownership of that. The CEO is so important in terms of working with the board. I agree with you. He doesn't set it himself or herself. It's a collective activity, board and management. But the CEO must not somehow stick culture in a corner and say, well, that's the HR manager's job or that's the board's job. That was the point I was making.
Yeah, I want to agree with Colin. Yeah, it is a collective responsibility. This thing called culture, because it is so important. It shows up in everything that is done in the organization. Decisions that are made when people are not looking, which speaks to ethics. Your systems that are not being adhered to, which is accountability. All that is a collective, and I have seen it done very well, and I have seen it done not well at all. And when it is not done well, the outcome of that to fix that is almost a Herculean type of effort to fix it. So I think it's a collective responsibility with the CU and the executive management team, which again is trickle down. It's line of sight responsibility, executive managers, supervisors, employees, all collectively responsible for what you want to obtain in the organization as your culture. Yeah, and there are various methods to achieve that.
Yeah. Sarona, you have 4 minutes remaining to invite your panelists to give some closing remarks, and then we wrap up for today.
Yes, of course. Thank you. And of course, one of the things probably I just want to add in terms of, a collective agreement. Can you guys share one recommendation that every organization should take in terms of strengthening their culture, their ethics, and accountability? What would that be?
You're gonna start with me, obviously. To choose one is really difficult for me. But I would say if I focus on accountability in terms of strengthening your systems, where your people concerns, you see clarity in terms of your role and function, which comes down to simple things like JDs and so on, and that being communicated, your performance management process, your compliance with your quality performance management systems, very important. And then the last thing I would say to kind of complement that would be your grievance procedures, your grievance policy procedures, because that's where employees get heard. And of course, your disciplinary procedures, because you need to be very consistent from captain to cook and in terms of the application of that. That I think creates the consistent, or I should say, your culture that is resilient. Yeah? Okay.
Thank you, Delia. Glyne?
You're muted, Glyne.
Thanks. I was going to say that from my perspective, that I think it's a myriad of things, and one of the things as we sit in the boardroom or in leadership chair, one of the things we need to remember is that the institutions that we serve, that they don't exist just to survive the next reporting cycle. They're not just a piece of paper with a number at the bottom of an income statement. They actually exist to serve our communities, especially in our small economies. They support livelihoods. Behind every number is a person or a household or a family. They protect savings in terms of being able to generate income for persons. And they really truly provide the opportunity, and they carry obligations to persons who are not in the room. And so we need to remember as we go about our duties that it's not one thing, but it's a combination of everything that we do that will make the organization successful. And the next generation that has to follow on, and that's whether that's the next generation of leaders, the next generation of directors, whoever steps into the shoes on whichever side of the coin, that they're not going to judge us by how things are today, but they're going to judge us by the actions and the choices that we made while we still had the opportunity to make the right one. And it's because of that that we must bear all three pillars in mind, and that we must make sure that we consciously make the effort to do the right things even when no one is watching. Thanks.
Thanks, Glyne.
Yeah, and Kamla, I would just add to that. I think it's really, if there's one thing to take home from this, I think that you have to make sure that you actually believe in the culture that you're trying to create. Make sure you're authentic about it. I think it all starts there. Do not be afraid to question values and norms and practices that are taken as given. And it's not a matter of questioning them so you can then dismantle them. Question them so you understand why you believe in them. I think we're often too afraid to say, oh, but we have to have this. Why do we have to ask yourself why you have to have it? Because if you understand why you have to have it, then you will believe in it. And then you will be able to explain to your team, why is it that this is something that we actually want to stand for? Why do we want to do this? We're not box checking. And I think that is really, really critical for any team, for any board, for any organization. Question it, don't white label it, make sure it's really authentically yours.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And I think today's session in terms of discussion really focuses on just that. We're not focusing on everything when a crisis hits. We're building it every day. You said it, we said it here. And I think that the choice that we make as leaders, and we cultivate that culture within the organization, and we build the standards that we want to achieve and to uphold. And I think that we have to embrace accountability. At the end of the day, if we're not being held accountable, then what's next? So I think the embracing of that accountability is very critical. And those invisible forces that we have is definitely going to determine whether our organization survives or not. And of course, we definitely want to see organizations thriving. So that would bring me to the end of this, and I'll hand you over back to Kamla. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarona. Great job for your first moderation for a panel. Very, very well done. And thank you to our panelists, Simone Pearson, Glyne Harrison, and Delia Joseph. Simone joining us from Jamaica, Glyne from Barbados, and Delia in Trinidad and Tobago. This, I think, was a truly, truly brilliant panel. And it's such a much needed conversation about understanding what are the things that impacts our culture, what creates it, when we need to take charge of it. And for me, it's a red flag if it is that your directors don't know what the culture of the organization is. Now, we have room for discussion in terms of who really sets that culture, who owns it, who is accountable, how do we ensure it gets through the organization. And we have a few days ahead of us that we can continue to engage this conversation. Tomorrow, we have focus on governance of the private sector, which is where the majority of us are, and therefore very important conversations to be had. We begin the session with Karen Pereira, very experienced attorney at law and someone who has served as director on several boards as well. She will begin the day for us as we look at governance of the private sector as we continue our theme of governance in a volatile world. It's already past our time to cut off for today. So I want to thank everyone who has stayed with us throughout the day. Please do give us your feedback. Tell us why you stayed. Tell us what are some of the things you like. Tell us what you don't like as well, so we know where we can improve. But certainly so that we can continue to grow Governance Week every year in order that it be impactful enough that it helps make a difference in how your governance is grown and practiced. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of the evening, and I'll see you all tomorrow for day 2 of Governance Week 2026.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Wonderful session, Kamla. Wonderful session, all panelists. Take care. And moderators.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm just so proud of CCGI.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you so much, Quantrell. Thank you for those of you who stayed with us till the very end. Have a wonderful rest of the evening, and we will see you tomorrow.